You're It. I'm Amanda Malcolm, and you're listening to You're It, Girl, a podcast focused on you and what propels you. Because that past, it does not define you. Your time is now, and you're it, girl. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. This is part 2 of episode 0. If you missed part 1, check back to last week's episode. After that, my parents' divorce just became, she was obviously very sad and very angry. And their divorce became the most tumultuous thing that you could possibly imagine. Pretty much everything that you should not do in a divorce, my parents did. And I know because I'm divorced now, so I know what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And they were just plain horrible to each other. Once the whole thing was finalized, my mom went on a dating rampage, and there was a dude over at the house all the time. I can't even believe, actually, when I think back on that those guys were cool coming over to our house, hanging out with all the kids at the house. It blows my mind, and nothing against men, but this blows my mind at what they actually were willing to endure, just to get laid. I don't know. None of them lasted very long, obviously, because nobody wants to be a dad to 8 kids. So this also, I don't think my mom was expecting. And so she continued to kind of drink a lot and take more sleeping pills. And she started to get very mean. She would often, lock my door. I would often lock my door to my room while she was basically screaming at the top of her lungs, banging on it for various reasons that literally made no sense. If you've ever been around an addict, the things that set them off don't really make a whole lot of sense. She also neglected cleaning anything in the house, and the long list of chores on my list for the family that we had was growing. One night, while we were talking in my room, after kind of hanging some pictures on the walls, I don't remember what this topic was, but I made the comment that whatever we were talking about was logical. And she immediately turned and looked at me with this. And again, if you've been around an addict, you've probably seen this, with this fire in her eyes, and I was her target. She picked up the hammer next to her and started coming after me with it. And I went into my bed and pulled the covers up over me as if the blankets were going to protect me if my mom was actually going to hit me with a hammer. She didn't hit me with the hammer, but as she's this close to my face with the hammer in her hand, screaming so loud that she's spitting in my face, I knew that I had to leave. And she eventually lowered the hammer, and the next day I packed a suitcase. I was 17, and I left. And I went and moved in with a friend of mine who lived in Old Town. Her dad had bought her a condo, and I started living with her. And my mom did beg me to come back. And I had just graduated high school, a month prior. But I just couldn't go back. But I always felt guilty about that because I left my siblings there in that house with her. And I knew what it was becoming, and I sort of knew what it was going to end up being like. And so I sort of remained close, but couldn't go back. And I don't know that I'll ever be able to forgive myself for leaving them all there. But at the same time, I knew that I couldn't stay. The next few years, it would just get increasingly worse. I was in college, working full time, stayed close to my mom's house. My mom would go on these crazy 3-4 day binges where she would drink and then take sleeping pills. Sometimes she would be out of it for days. She wouldn't even be able to speak coherent sentences. Once I went on a rescue mission to the house after one of the kids had called me, and she was sitting on the steps buttoning this blue jean shirt that she would always wear. And it took her 30 minutes to button one button on that shirt. That's how out of it she was. And so many of these times I would just take my siblings out of there. I had my own apartment at this or condo at this time that my dad had helped us with. And so we had kind of a safe place, which was sort of actually set up for that reason. I kind of forgot about that. It was sort of set up for this reason, a place that we could kind of go if I needed to take them out. And so I would take them out. And for a couple of days, she actually wouldn't even notice. 48 hours, she wouldn't even notice her kids were gone. And then as she sort of would come out of this state of mind, she would notice and she would be very angry. And she would call me screaming to return them, threaten to call the police, saying that I'd kidnapped them. And so I'd have to bring them back. And I always felt so bad about doing that, but also felt like I had no choice. She was really difficult to reason with. And, I don't know if any of you also have experience with anybody who's mixed alcohol with sleeping pills, or the sleeping pills, specifically Ambien, but it's not a good combo. And if you mix it with alcohol, it's even worse. It's sort of known for several side effects, one of which includes sleepwalking. And when they're doing that, they often sometimes have this tendency to sort of prepare food that's not cooked. So, I have a lot of younger siblings, and a lot of times my siblings were also eating, raw and uncooked food because my mom was sort of in this state of mind. And some of the things that she would also do is she would show up at my siblings' school. My sister was in cheer at the time, and she had a lot of after-school activities. And my mom would show up to pick her up and, drive intoxicated to the school and not really know what time it was, and show up and wait for her outside on the bench and basically pass out. And the school would call me or my other sister to come and say we had to pick up my little sister. And it just, when I look back on it, it blows my mind. And this is going to blow your mind too, because the cheer coach was a police officer. And there was so much going on when I was a child, thinking about all these things. I look back on it now, and there's some volunteer things that I do with Child Crisis Arizona, and there's the reason why I am involved in that organization, and it is because of this. Because in the education system, and as a police officer, where you're responsible for young children, if you were witnessing this happening at the school in public, what do you think was actually going on behind closed doors? And why did you think that it would be better not to do something? So this is the kind of thing that as an adult now, I really look out for young children. And when you see something, you say something, because that type of thing should have been something that an adult should have stood up for. And it was so obvious. It was so obvious as to what was going on. Obviously, because no one does anything, this gets worse. My mom's driving with kids in the car drunk. She's getting pulled over, and police officers are still not doing anything. They literally impound her car like 3 separate times. And my brother has to go down to the impound and get it out. Sometimes God gives second chances, and sometimes he gives people 10, 15, 20 chances. And you know what? Life's not fair. Sometimes some people are just going to get more chances than others. Freaking get over it. But some people just get lucky and they get more. And she got a lot of chances. And, eventually her luck just, quite frankly, ran out. One day she was in the car, and I honestly think this time a neighbor called on her, and she got pulled over and she got a DUI. And, I never saw the paperwork on this DUI, and my mom told everyone that the police officer beat her up. And when I went to pick her up at the police station, she had bruises, on her body, and she was dirty. And I just will never know the full story. And to be quite honest, she probably doesn't remember, but I know that she was probably pretty hard to take down. And so she got an extreme DUI, and she went to Tent City. And who do you think was responsible for taking care of the kids? Now, it was only 10 days, but a few things made this very difficult. I was going to school full time. I had a full-time job, and now I was going to be a mom to these kids for the next 10 days while my mom was, serving in Tent City with Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And thinking back, actually, if they knew that they were taking a mom out of the house with no one to watch them but another child, I'm not really sure, they would have done that. But, the system is fucked up. So I don't really know what to say. Sorry for swearing. I don't really like to swear, but, sometimes it just feels good to say it. So although it was kind of nice to have her detained for a little while, it's not like it was that easy. My mom also has this, challenge with sort of breeding animals. And so she had a lot of dogs. She always had a lot of puppies. And, no one cleaned up after these dogs. So I've got all these kids. I'm in a house that's basically covered in dog poop. And the house it's just a disaster, and it's completely disgusting. And my siblings are, living in filth. And we can go into my mom's dog breeding and animal breeding on another episode, because that's a whole nother thing, which I would really like to analyze. But anyway, while my mom is in Tent City, I am driving the kids to school, and I am speeding. I am late one morning, and I got to get these kids to school because I got to get down to a class at ASU, and then I have to go to work. And so I'm speeding, and a police officer stops me. He comes over to the window, and I look into the back seat, and my little brother starts crying. He starts crying, and he takes off his seatbelt and kind of crouches on the floor. I'm like, what the heck is he doing? And he's like, oh, great. He's like, now we're going to be even later. He's like, we're going to have to wait for backup. And I think in my mind, I'm like, oh my gosh. My mom has been pulled over so many times with my siblings in the car that my little brother literally thinks that when you get pulled over by a police officer, that you're going to have to get out of the car, you're going to have to wait on the side of the road and wait for backup for someone to come impound your car, and then someone's going to have to come and get you. I look at him and I was like, honey, it's okay. I was like, I was just speeding. I'm just going to get a ticket, and then we're going to go to school. It's going to be fine. I roll down my window. The police officer looks at me, and I look up at him, and he's like, you were speeding. I'm like, I know. I said, you know what? I said, I got all these, I'm like almost in tears. I'm like, I got all these kids. I got to get them to school. My mom's in Tent City. I said, I just, I'm just running late. And he looks at me. He looks at the kids in the back seat, and he says, I'm going to be in this same spot when you come back after dropping off those kids. So just make sure that you're going the speed limit. And he walks away, and I burst into tears. It sounds so crazy, but at that moment, I had been so strong and just stepping into the role of just making sure that everybody was taken care of, and no one saw me. And I feel like in that moment, that random police officer, I wish I knew who he was because I would thank him. I just felt like I was seen, and I knew that I would be able to, continue doing what I was doing for my siblings. After my mom got out of Tent City, the next couple of years would be kind of tough. My mom refinanced her house a good amount of times before the recession of 2008. She started dating this guy that she was really into, and she went to Europe for a couple of weeks. And, my mom started running out of money, and the house started falling apart. There were leaks. There was black mold. The list goes on and on and on. And one particular time that I remember when her boyfriend was gone and she was on a 3-day binge, I came up to get my siblings and brought them to the condo I was living in. It had been actually a few months since I'd seen them because she was dating somebody, so she was doing kind of quite well. And, so now she had kind of, fallen off into a binge, which happens. And so I brought my siblings down to my house. And again, it had been a couple months since I'd seen them. And my littlest sister, had this long blonde hair. And it was in a giant mat. Like you could literally pick up the whole thing. Her clothes are filthy. Her shoes are filthy. Her teeth are slimy. My other little siblings too. And they smell. And I call my brother and I'm like, oh my gosh. I was like, brother, I don't know what we're going to do. I was like, our kids are like the smelly kids in school. Like, what are we going to do? This is getting worse. So we have them for a couple days. I take her to get a haircut. We have to chop all of it off. We take them to buy them some clothes and shoes. And then, of course, when the time comes, we kind of have to return them home. About this time, I make some calls for help. I call my grandparents. I call my mom's friends. I call my dad. And I beg, like I'm begging now for someone to come out and help me. I say to these adults, like, there is no way that I can do this anymore by myself. This situation has gotten so big and so out of control that I can't do it. There's mold in the house. There's no hot water in the house. Like, these kids are living up there and my mom is out of it, half the time. Everybody is in complete denial, thinking that my mom is sick or something. And my dad, he doesn't live here. He lives in Illinois. He never came back out. So my dad does call CPS at this time. And, CPS takes about 3 weeks to come out. 3 weeks. Again, the system is pretty messed up. By the time they come out, my mom is, not on a binge anymore. And so all the kids are sort of scared. And so everyone just sort of lies for her. And this is sort of actually pretty common for kids to do for their parents. They're always wanting to protect them. It's sort of this like innate, like biological thing, right? And, the CPS worker doesn't even do anything, doesn't look around, doesn't do anything at all, just kind of takes all of our word for it, knowing that child psychology 101 is for kids literally to lie for their parents because they do not want to be taken away from their parents. It is scary to be in a room one-on-one with someone from CPS who's asking you questions about your mom. No kid, I'm sorry, I think no child is going to tell the truth. And it's up to that trained professional where they should have known something was up, just like the school should have known. And, I guess they weren't in any real immediate danger. Like no one was physically abusing them. But there was emotional abuse, mental abuse, and the circumstances in which they were living in. The house was filthy. There was dog poop everywhere. There was black mold. There was no hot water. And my siblings were literally eating candy for dinner. But no one really seemed to notice. And no one really seemed to want to help either. In fact, I think it was a lot easier for a lot of people just to pretend that it wasn't happening. Eventually, my mom would lose the house to foreclosure. Obviously, she refinanced it a million times. And like a lot of people, her mortgage increased and she couldn't afford to fix anything and she lost the house. I never went up there to help her move out of it. I always feel bad about that, but I was actually glad that that house was gone. And oddly, it's so strange, like psychologically, because a lot of my siblings are still attached to that house. I have never gone back to look at it. In my mind, that house is an absolute nightmare, and I wish for it to be erased from all of my childhood memories. But this is where everyone's circumstances and experiences are so different, because my siblings sometimes still talk about that house, and they'll go up there and they'll sort of look at it from a distance. And even though it was so traumatic, they were so young and it was still their home. After my mom lost her house, my grandfather jumped in to save the day and would buy my mom another house. This is where they were actually really great at helping out. I think it was like the one way that they actually kind of knew how to do something. It didn't really solve anything, of course, but at least she was a little bit closer to town now. The house wasn't so far out. And, I wish that I could say, now that things improved over the years, but really my siblings just got older. And so they didn't really need to be rescued as much anymore. They kind of realized that but they were kind of now able to sort of take care of themselves a little bit more. And I didn't need to come in and remove them all the time. And, for years I struggled with a lot of these things. It really tore me apart. I would have nightmares of my mom screaming at me, which all of my siblings have, by the way, which is really interesting from a psychological perspective. A lot of us have talked about that. She would call me and leave terrible messages. And, I would try not to listen to them, but I would just feel like I kind of had to. And, I would be so strong and then burst into tears. And, she would say just the most villainous things, like things you wouldn't even say to an enemy. And they're not worth repeating, but trust me, you wouldn't even want to hear them. And just think of the very worst insult that you could possibly give somebody and, throw some like swear words and some like vulgar, like really inappropriate things on top of that. And then multiply it by 10 by the fact that the person that's telling you this is your own mom, who knows everything about you and every little weakness. And so everything that they can say, they know right how to just like get you right in the heart to really kind of mess with your head. So imagine how that makes you feel as a young person. In my mid-20s, I got married. And I guess you could say it was a bit of a scandal because he was not only my boss and much older, but he was also married. Now, he said they were kind of like roommates and they were unhappy. And I think we all kind of know that that's what people generally say under those circumstances. And so we carried on an affair. I was 19, almost 20, and he was 37. Now, let me be clear that I value marriage, but my sort of take on committed relationships at that time was definitely not what it is now. Remember, I had witnessed my mom have several affairs. So my take on committed relationships was sort of, rather a little bit skewed. He would eventually get a divorce. And as you can imagine, it was kind of a little bit of a messy one. And, thinking back, despite all of that, he really sort of rescued me. I met him when I'd started working for him when I was 16 and then started, dating him when I was 19, almost 20. And at that time, I was working full time, putting myself through school, and I was making trips to my mom's house quite frequently to sort of rescue my siblings whenever my mom was on binges. And so, my life was a little bit of a mess. And he carried me through that. So he really was a bit of a rescuer. And so I also really thought that this was true love. But that relationship, the foundation of it anyway, didn't really start the way a successful relationship should. And he was a 37-year-old man with his own ghosts and that I didn't know about. And even though, I was of an adult age, I was still kind of just a girl. But, I fell in love with him. He was easy to love. He was so likable and kind and charismatic. He really knew how to treat a girl. And I was so young. I'd never been treated like that. I dated when I was a teenager. There were always flowers and gifts and like sweet sentiments. And he was really kind of a true romantic. And it had obviously gotten him into trouble in previous relationships. And of course, his marriage. He wasn't always a faithful person. But I thought I was so special, And even if you do feel like you're special, he made me feel special. It doesn't mean that someone's going to be faithful to you. You can love somebody and not be faithful. These are two very different things. And being faithful may actually be harder than staying in love. Think about that, because love is a feeling and staying faithful is a choice. And he had trouble with that. And he had a lot of ghosts too. And he was actually an alcoholic. Forgot to mention that one little detail. Students of therapy, why do you think that Amanda Malcolm was attracted to the alcoholic older man who she thought would rescue her? Textbook, I know, and I really don't like being a statistic, but obviously he did not drink when we met. I actually have an extreme aversion to anybody who drinks a lot. I am so sensitive to it and so sensitive to any substance abuse. It is like a no-go for me and literally causes like discomfort like in my gut. All those things are a no-go. So his non-existent drinking also made me feel very safe and very secure, which is something that any female is always attracted to. That's the number one thing that we say we look for in a man is safety and security. And then also, given my past and childhood, it was very important and it felt so good to feel that way. But what I learned is that just because you're not drinking now, if you're an alcoholic, doesn't mean that you're not going to start drinking later. And an addict will often battle with other addictive tendencies. And what can also happen is that there can also be something that can act as an extreme trigger, and then they might relapse. And he did. What was the extreme trigger? Unfortunately, it was the birth of our daughter. Kind of a bummer, I know. I was a new mom. He had 3 kids from a previous marriage, my stepchildren at the time, and I honestly don't really think he wanted to have another child, but it was sort of a compromise for me, right? And my 3 stepkids, they were put in the middle of a good amount of trauma. And I have always felt bad that we lived many years and didn't really have a solid relationship. Their parents didn't really want us to. It's really kind of strange. They were really uncomfortable with their own ghosts and fears. And so they didn't want their kids to have to sort of defend themselves in school. And so I wasn't allowed to go to their things, to the school functions, to birthday parties. And so it always really bothered me. Like, how do you get close to somebody when you can't be involved, in their things? I was married to him for 7 years and with him for 13, and I never attended one of the kids' birthday parties. I wish that I was stronger then to be able to stand up for myself. I sort of tried, but didn't really, I guess I just didn't have the tools to be able to do that. And I hope to have, a second shot at repairing those relationships because they were just children. They're young adults now. And they are close to my daughter, obviously. But I wish that our relationship could have been different. When our daughter was about a month old, my husband decided that he was going to take a 2-week golf trip with a friend to Europe. And he had just started drinking, prior, just to sort of kind of prep himself for this trip. And now, mind you, I had just had a baby. She was like 3 weeks old, and he decides that he's going to go on a trip for 2 weeks and leave me at home alone with our brand new infant. So he returns, and for the next 9 months, he starts drinking. And that strong, safe, secure man that I met was no longer those things. And I had a little girl who was, an infant, and I had never felt more like a little girl stuck in my mom's house than in that time period. I was alone, changing diapers with an alcoholic person. And this time, it was not my mom, it was my husband. And this time, the child wasn't a sibling, it was my own. One night, he was drinking and I left with Kennedy, my daughter, in her little carrier. And I drove around for a bit crying, realizing I had nowhere to go. And as a new mom, you often feel quite alone. But I realized I couldn't go to my mom's because I was not about to go to her house. My dad lived in Illinois. All my siblings were younger and my friends were in various relationships. And honestly, I didn't want to be a burden to them either and didn't want to reach out for help. I had been taught to hide things. And I hid them well. And I had also been taught that asking for help doesn't really get you anywhere with a lot of adults. And the only person that could really help me was myself because she had done it in the past and she was reliable. And me, had gotten myself out of a whole lot. And now I had a tiny little girl that I had to take care of. And as I'm driving around, I'm thinking that my husband's going to call me, like that he's going to come after me and say that he's sorry, but he doesn't. And so after about an hour or so, I go back home and I come into the house and he looks at me and he just kind of shrugs, like completely not caring, and says, this is harder than you thought, isn't it? Being a mom. And the truth was, it was the hardest job. And it is the hardest job. Being a mom is the hardest thing in the world. And this is why you're supposed to have a partner. This is why it takes 2 people to have a baby. And not having a partner makes it even harder. And he was pretty adamant, before he married me, that he would never marry someone again who didn't work. His previous wife didn't work. And, their divorce was similar to my parents. It was absolutely horrible. And so not working was not an option. I never took any time off after I had my daughter. I was working all day. The day that I had her, when I was in the hospital, while she was sleeping, I worked. I also had and felt a tremendous amount of pressure to maintain my appearance. You know what I mean? I had just had a baby. And remember, I was married to somebody who I knew had been unfaithful in the past. And I was not about to risk that, because even though he was drinking, I still needed to have that person, and I could not risk him being unfaithful and then truly feeling alone, and trying to be the perfect mom, the perfect worker, the perfect wife to a man that was half there was, to be quite honest, like incredibly exhausting. And I did feel incredibly isolated. Watching an alcoholic unravel is also a terrible thing to witness. What started as a few beers quickly turned into him like pouring a glass of scotch or whiskey and coming home late into the evening, 11 or 12 at night. And he'd put on a hoodie and listen to AC/DC music while playing putt-putt golf in our backyard. So you could definitely see that things were progressing very, very quickly. And it did not last long. It lasted for 9 months. And we were at a Super Bowl party with his friends. He was drinking. We got into the car. I had wanted to, I said I needed to drive home. He completely refused. We're in the car. Kennedy, the little baby, is my daughter's screaming, crying. He's yelling at his daughter to get her to stop crying. I'm telling him to calm down, telling him to pull over, that he shouldn't drive upset. Now, I've learned because of my mom that there is no way that you want to tell an alcoholic that's drunk that they should not be driving. I realize in this moment that my entire childhood has prepared me again for this moment, while I have other children in the car trying to get through this moment into safety. We get into the house. He's screaming. He's yelling. I'm in one of the kids' bedroom nursing my baby, and he is telling me to get out of the room. And I just look at him and I say, no. I said, no, I am not going to leave this room until the kid's mom comes. You're going to leave the room. And he leaves the room, he slams the door, he punches a hole in the wall. Eventually the kid's mom arrives. I walk them outside. They run into their mom's arms. Now, I've been married to this man for 7 years, and his ex-wife has never spoken to me. And in that moment, she looks at me and she says, please come with me. I said, no, I'm fine. I was holding the baby. And I think back on that and I'm like, anybody that I've told this story to that's a friend is like, weren't you scared? And even his ex-wife was like, are you okay? Like you should be scared. And I was not afraid. It's so interesting when I look back on that, like how I measure fear. Because of my experience, I was not scared of him. I could see him. And so I just knew that he wasn't going to do anything so extreme that I was going to be afraid for my life. And so I guess fear was just sort of a little bit, non-existent. So obviously our marriage would end. But I'm grateful for it. And I'm grateful that because of him, I was able to be safe and secure for a while, to sort of grow my wings. And when that moment came, even though I didn't want that relationship to end, I realized that I had to fly. And I'm grateful to him. Because of him, I also became a mom. I have an amazing daughter, and I was able to get help from a therapist. And my daughter's dad and I have a great relationship, and we're great co-parents. People say we should actually write a book because of how well we co-parent each other, because of how well we co-parent together, and how we really have a good understanding of each other and each other's trauma. And so when people ask me why I look at things so positively, why I see the glass half full, why I never look at people with judgment, and why I accept people for who they are, I just realize that I have so much to be grateful for, and I have so much to be thankful for. And when it comes to people, you just never know their story. I mean, would you have guessed any of this about me? I mean, I feel like I sort of became, and we all sort of do this, we sort of become the master creator of sort of the perfect perception of how we want other people to see us. And I don't want you to think that that's inauthentic or not genuine. It's not what I mean. Most of the time, it's just that you just don't know the whole story. You're seeing people's highlights because the backstory, it just doesn't really look cool on social media. It's a little bit cringy. All of this that I just talked about it's a little cringy. It makes people uncomfortable. And ultimately, people want to emulate things that just look good. You get more likes. It just kind of feels better. But this is why I don't judge others, and I sort of see the world through a unique lens because of these things that I experienced and because of watching my siblings go through these same things too. And this is why I always just forgive and always try to bring happiness with me wherever I go, in hopes that if someone else is going through something, that they're going to see that smile or take that hello, and it's going to give them the strength that they need that day. My mom is still struggling, and my boundaries with her are strong, and she's in my life. And I hope for her to one day recognize another chance when it does come her way. I know that she must have a lot of ghosts, but I also know that I'm powerless to change her, and I only have control over one thing and one person, and that is me. That's myself. These things I know. And sometimes they're still hard to deal with, as they are for you and for all of us, and I'm not always strong. Sometimes I break down, and only a few people have seen me cry, and I almost cried a couple times today because I was taught to be strong to survive. It's a protective mechanism. Sometimes I don't feel like I'm being the greatest mom. Sometimes I feel like, some of these things from my childhood are just, ingrained in me, that I'll never be good enough. And so that's why I'm always trying to do more, trying to spread happiness, more joy, inspire people, because I never want people to feel uncomfortable or bad about themselves. I want them to know that despite those ghosts from our past, that our past does not define us. It shapes us and transforms us and forces us to spread our wings, even if there's a tear. The wind is blowing hard or it's pouring rain. You just have to find a way to glide like a butterfly does.